MP, it feels like every area of life at the moment is undergoing revolution.
I'm glad you said that, Bretto, because at this year's Wellness Summit virtual experience, all of our speakers are presenting on the revolution.
Yeah, and it's such a topsy-turvy world right now. It feels like everything's been turned upside down, whether it's your finances, your food, your health, your longevity, your family. All of these things are just in such a state of flux right now that we really need to get the experts in to give us the lowdown.
That's why we have Jason Witten on the financial revolution, Cindy O'Meara on the food revolution,
Kim Morrison on the self-love revolution, Marcus Pearce on the longevity revolution,
the great Brett Hill on the resilience revolution, Andrea Huddleston on the hormones revolution,
and of course Joe Witten on the food and family revolution.
And for the first time ever, we'll have breakout sessions on the energy revolution, the career revolution,
the barefoot revolution, the real food revolution,
and the parenting revolution. All this and more at the Wellness Summit, September 11 and 12. Book your tickets at thewellnesssummit.com.
Welcome to Nourishing the Mother, where inspired women talk about the journey of motherhood through the common thread of parenting, relationship, and sexuality as a path to consciousness. We ask, in what ways can we show up more fully, live more meaningfully, parent more wholly, and love more unconditionally? How can we mine the wisdom from the experiences of our lives and expand into those challenges? If you are here, you care about paving a path of conscious and intentional motherhood, connected with yourself and your gifts, and also illuminating your children in theirs, so we may raise more whole humans who can impact this world in a more humane way. And if you feel like giving a little back to this free content, please become a patron of the show and receive extra member benefits for less than a coffee a month. Or you can leave a review on iTunes and Facebook, all of which helps the podcast keep going and reach more mamas who need this type of tonic for the soul. Head on over to patreon.com/NTM podcast to find out more. We are Julie Tenner and Bridget Wood, and we are so grateful you're here.
Hello and welcome to Nourishing the Mother. I'm Bridget Wood.
And I'm Julie Tenner, and today we have a very special interview with Dr. Sophie Brock, and we will be talking around mothers as a marginalised group within society, and we are so excited to have this conversation with such a wealth of wisdom and insight and heart. So welcome, Sophie. Would you like to say a quick hello?
Hi, thank you for having me.
Such a pleasure. So before we do that, I'd just love to remind you to jump onto nourishingthemother.com.au, scroll on down to the red banner, drop on in your email address, and then we can let you know and keep you in the loop of anything that's happening out in the big wide world with us and Nourishing the And you can pick and choose where you'd love to dive deeper. So nourishingthemother.com.au.
So I want to tell you a little bit about Sophie before we jump into the conversation. So Dr. Sophie Brock is a sociologist who specialises in motherhood studies and is a single mother to her 3-year-old daughter. Her work advocates for the liberation of mothers from the myths of perfect motherhood, translating academic research on motherhood to the public forum. She offers online education, mentoring, and hosts the Good Enough Mother podcast to support mothers in reclaiming an empowered practice of mothering for themselves. Welcome, Sophie.
Thank you for having me. And I mean, I think I basically have to start by acknowledging you two and Nourishing the Mother, because I honestly do not think I would be doing what I'm doing if it weren't for you two. And I know I gush over you two, but honestly, this podcast has been, life-changing for me. And I think it's really shown the power that we actually have as mothers individually and collectively in being able to make enormous shifts in individuals' lives through collectivizing and coming together.
I remember the first email we got from you and it hit our inbox and I read it just like clutching my heart. And then I sent it to Julie. I said, look at this woman, like, you know, such a story and then such incredible, you know, breadth and depth of knowledge around mothering. Like, and I think I was so excited to see your academic lens on motherhood too, which I'm super excited for us to get into.
So, Sophie, what I'd love to start with is you came on, gosh, we've been a couple of months ago now, I think, in our soul-driven motherhood group, and you did a workshop in there around the cultural constructions of motherhood. And I was like, oh my God, I love this. And I was messaging Bridget, I'm hitting pause and I'm messaging things to be like, oh my God, what about this sentence? You know, it was like, I was hacking out this, what I actually thought was an incredible workshop within there. And I was so deeply inspired by the wisdom and the way in which you spoke about motherhood and how you pulled all of those points together. And so I'd written down a few here that I was like, yeah, that's what it is. And I'd never thought about it before, you know. So I thought perhaps we could start by, I could just read a couple of those to you and then you can just see where it leads for you.
Oh, yeah, that sounds good.
So mothers as a marginalised group. And initially I was like, are they though? Are they really a marginalised group? Because as a white woman of privilege, it's hard for me to wrap my head around that, particularly when I'm really spending as much time as I can really investing in what the experience is of marginalised communities and how that's reflective, you know, of us culturally and certainly of our family narrative and, you know, all the things. And so to then contemplate that potentially I sit within a group that is also marginalised, initially I was like, oh, I don't know about that. I'm like this white woman who sits upon a huge amount of privilege that I'm completely aware of, you know. But I just want to hit into these points. And I was like, yeah, God, I like get that, you know, that there's a stifling if they are voicing opinions out in the big wide world, that there's unheard pain and suffering, that there's joking around more complex issues, that the pay gap of a mother versus a non-mother is a real issue, and that mothers don't get a seat at the political table. And I was like, yeah, true. And I just, honestly, those words, that's why I wrote them down, because for the rest of that afternoon, I was like, I just kept ruminating on them and sitting with that. And I really felt the impact and the power of feeling into the truth of what the cultural construction, as you have very eloquently coined, being the way that I view myself then in the world, and what an impact that actually has, and how even I had silenced myself really, or stifled my voice because of that marginalization that I'd never acknowledged. So I just want you to know that that was a really powerful awakening for me, and I really loved your words.
Thank you, Julie. That means a lot. And I think that that's an awakening that many of us in this space have, and an awakening that I actually had before I became a mother, because I delved into all of this work before I became a mother. And so I had an awareness around the differences. But I wanted to just quickly speak to first your comment around privilege, because I think that's a really important point to acknowledge, particularly in this context, in recognizing that privilege is something that's intersectional. So in other words, we can be privileged in one area of our lives and marginalized in another. And the dynamic of that is really complex, and it's actually one that is, it is alluring to simplify it. It's alluring to say, this group here are marginalized and this group here are privileged. This group here holds the power and these are the ones who are subordinate. But in reality, it's so much more complex than that. If we want to talk about racial privilege and marginalization based on race, we also need to talk about marginalization based on sex. You know, we can also talk about marginalization based on disability, on your ability. We can also talk about it in terms of ageism. We can talk about it in terms of socioeconomics, where you were raised, the level of education your parents had. I mean, all of these different things go into shaping and making up our way of being in the world, how we experience the world, how we see the world, and how the world sees us. And so we can both be privileged as white women who are middle class, who are heterosexual, who are married. All of those things feed into what privilege means. But there's also a bunch of ways that you can experience marginalization. And so the way that I talk about and frame motherhood is to recognize that motherhood is a social class and a social role and a social positioning in the same way that race is, in the same way that sex is, in the same way that your economic status is. When women become mothers, they enter into a particular social class, a particular social location. And when we don't name that, when we invisibilize that and we just pretend that that doesn't exist, then we make invisible the struggles that mothers go through. And you can't face and change what you don't acknowledge. And the next layer of this that I know that we'll get into talking about is this operates so perfectly, in a sense, because mothers hold so much power. And so it keeps certain groups of society and society running in a certain way. It keeps that functioning by convincing us that we don't have that power.
Because by us being disempowered, we're very malleable and, you know, at the mercy of the systems that rely on us. But because we don't have a strong voice, it means we
it keeps the pre-established construct of power intact. There's no challenging or superseding of that.
And if you don't give women an understanding of the identity transformation that motherhood creates, then you leave them lost. And when you're lost, you're not in your power either. Like, you're kind of still trying to clamor for some sense of who you are. So you're swept up in that unraveling and trying to find something to hold on to, because our culture doesn't recognize or support that transformation.
So I wondered, Sophie, if you could just, because I love that idea of the invisibility, and what you keep invisible then can't change by virtue of the fact that you're not aware of it. Can you just tease out a little bit for me what that means to experience invisibility or to be invisible within a cultural context?
So what it means is that in particular context, naming your experience of being a mother or naming the challenges you face as a mother would be ridiculed, dismissed, potentially put you in danger, potentially put the position you're currently within under threat. So I'm thinking workplaces here and the ways that we compartmentalize our role as women in workplaces, and kind of hide away our motherhood. And it's not a judgment on when we do that, but it's a recognition that we're doing that purposefully, knowing that the role of being a mother is one that is attached to particular meanings. And part of the problem that I see socially is that I think that we've equated our power and our liberation with the rejection of motherhood. I think that we have associated our lack of representation at higher levels of kind of government, politics, in society, in what we would consider and define to be positions of power, although that is contentious. I think that we have framed getting there through rejecting or hiding away our role as mothers. And that's because we, in a society like ours, and, you know, to make a side point here, that it doesn't have to be this way, and it's not this way. This is something that is culturally embedded, and it's shiftable, it's changeable. But we're living within a society that has certain priority of value around the individual, around economic prosperity, around being the provider, around being the one who is standing on your own 2 feet, autonomy, agency. All of that is reflected in our language, our cultural values, our social policies. And what that does for mothers is it puts us in a really a position where we're basically stuck, because to be a good mother means something that is almost opposite than what it means to be a successful citizen in the world.
Oh, that's so true.
Because I mean, isn't that also reflective of the rejection collectively of the feminine and the celebration of the traits of the masculine as what gets things done in the world? And seeing those two things as separate and they cannot coexist, right? But you're saying that that's your cultural construct, and that ultimately the more that we recognize how one contributes to the other and is of service to the other, the more that they can each, coexist.
Yeah, and I mean, I think actually part of the reason why patriarchy operates and is continually maintained and sustained is because I think on a deep level we know how powerful mothers are. We know how powerful a role it is to be creating, literally birthing, shaping, raising the next generation of people that are going to run the world, that are going to change our society, that make up our society. That's a really powerful role. The whole hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. I think on a level that we know that, but what it would require if we were actually supported and enabled to step into our power in a way that is socially recognizable, acknowledged, valued, named, seen, what it would do is it would require power structures to shift, which would mean that some who are currently in power would need to relinquish some of it. And that's not what the system works. That's not the way it works.
Yeah. You touched a little bit on before that you would really like to see motherhood as reflected in GDP. And that until the service of motherhood is reflected in an economic term, it's going to be very hard for there to be any kind of cultural shift towards recognising mothers and therefore helping mothers feel identified in a culture. Can you explain a little bit about that and what that would look like?
Yeah, so this is really tricky because I have two ways of approaching this. One is to challenge the linking of value that we have between productivity, particularly economic productivity, with value and self-worth. So it's to say that, well, something can be valuable and worthy without it having to be economically viable. Or, why do we have to attach a dollar amount to something that is meaningful? So looking at the example of breast milk here as one example of this, there are two ways you can look at this. You can say, well, by not counting breast milk as part of the GDP and by saying that, breastfeeding is free, we're invisibilising women's labour. It's only free if our time, labour, energy, body is not worth anything. So on the one hand, we can say, actually not counting it as part of the GDP, but counting dairy and goat's milk and all other milks as part of it is actually ignoring an enormous amount of work and labour that mothers are engaging in. But then the other flip side of this could be saying, well, why do we have to commodify something in order to see it as valuable? So I think it's important to recognise both of these, but to ultimately come back to the acknowledgement that we're living within a capitalist society that does value these things, and our value and our worth often is tied to how we exist as financially. And in very real and practical terms, this makes a difference in terms of whether you're at home with children or whether you are earning an income, or how you're trying to navigate a way of doing both. And so part of the reason why I think that we need to bring in this conversation around the economic valuing of motherhood is because mothers experience very real consequences through it not being valued. Older divorced women are the highest growing population in Australia of homelessness. Why is that the case? We cannot examine that and expect to fix that or contribute to change if we are not talking about motherhood. And I think this is why it's so important to bring this to the front of our conversation and our consciousness when thinking about social change, because so many of the issues I believe that we face in terms of our social justice and inequalities, particular, gender disparities, I think we have to be talking about motherhood. Motherhood affects more women than any other feminist issue, but we aren't able to name that.
It's not as sexy either, is it?
No.
And I think because of the nature of feminism, and as some voices in the feminist movement, in the 70s, cast out motherhood and saw it as this place where women go to feel repressed, has actually in and of itself been a repressive tool, right? And just like feminism was almost forgotten about birth, they've kind of haven't taken motherhood under their wing either.
No, feminism has obviously acknowledging again there's all different types of feminism, but talking about kind of mainstream liberal feminism, I believe, and other maternal scholars argue as well, has forgotten about mothers, and in many ways not just forgotten about mothers but cast mothers out. Look at any major, if you are looking at any feminist events, panels, film festivals, anything that is attaching itself to the label of being a feminist organisation or pursuit of justice for women, I'm always curious to notice whether the language of motherhood and the needs and specific experiences of mothers are ever considered or recognised or even part of the conversation there. And oftentimes they're not.
Truth. I'm like, yeah, because there's so much of what you say that I feel like I just need to let it sit in my body and be like, yeah. Like, I really hope if you're listening to this podcast too that maybe you might slow it down and listen to it a couple of times and just hit pause and let it sink in, because I do think sometimes there's a potency of conversation of which I think that you're bringing here, Sophie, that really does deserve and need time to almost distill and render down into your own being and psyche, so that it can be birthed into a manifestation that moves outside of you. But it's kind of got to shake the ground first, doesn't it, and land somewhere for you that rings truth, and sometimes to shake out some debris in the process before it becomes a larger scale movement. What would you like to see as social change in the construct of the cultural paradigm of motherhood as it exists at the moment?
Oh, a lot. I think because I have been in this field of thinking for a long time, even though I'm a relatively new mother. I have a 3-year-old.
Actually, sorry, can I just press pause on that conversation? Just come back to you. I would love for you to share, because I know I've heard it in Soul of Motherhood, but I would love for you to share how you did this work before you became a mother. And in academia, how that was responded to, because I found that fascinating.
Yes,
I
me
too.
Oh,
it makes me angry.
Share that.
All right, so I'll pick up from that conversation and weave that in there.
All right.
Okay, so I think it's important first off to recognise that I do realise these conversations can be felt quite potently because they speak into our everyday lived experience. And when someone is speaking into that, yes, it can open up space for exploration and opportunity for change, but it also can be really painful at first as well.
Like destabilizing.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there's lots of changes that I would like to see for mothers to be made culturally, but also important to recognize that how you may be receiving this will depend on your current social location, and it will depend on where you currently are in your motherhood. It will depend on the ages of your children, if your children have additional needs or not. How we hear our information and how we listen to conversation beyond this, obviously, is dependent on those factors. There was also a beautiful quote. I can't remember who said this, but they said something to the effect of, how I speak is influenced by how you listen. And so, you can listen to the same thing multiple times and pull out different meanings according to where you are. And that perhaps relates into talking a little bit about what brought me to this work, and recognizing that even the way that I relate to this and understand these concepts has shifted and changed, and it will shift and change again. I dived into this work before I became a mum. It was I did my bachelor's degree, and actually, interestingly, whenever I had a choice of topic, it always came back to motherhood in some way. It's always been an interest of mine. In high school, I had my major work looking at Sylvia Plath and her diaries around motherhood and analysing women's work and perceptions of motherhood. So it's just always been curiosity.
So good. I often think we should go back to work out who we were before we decided who we think we are. I was reflecting, I have this, sorry, I'm going to side note just to go, please go and do that, because I often think, even when we think about VCE, or, if there was any studies that you did back then, what was your fascination? So I loved clay art. I loved modelling clay, and I modelled all these pregnant bellies. Yeah. And I have some of them sitting around in my garden now, because what are you going to do with a whole bunch of sculptures of pregnant bellies? And I was walking past one the other day going, I remember at the time the joke being, I hope she doesn't get herself into trouble. This is a bit of a fascination that could go the wrong way type of cultural context. But I just loved the shapes and the majesty of the body. And I'm like, and I ended up being a birth worker. Like, maybe we should just go back before we decide who we are in the world, you know?
But, and to look for the thread, in fact, I was teaching and training this morning, and I was talking about our children's values and how to map them and see them. And I was explaining how when I was 3, I've still got the plate, like, you know, the melamine plates.
Yeah.
And I remember at the time I was always drawing houses, and the houses I drew are the exact same house I live in now. And
oh my God.
Like same chimney in the same spot, windows in the same spot, you know, and home has been and houses and that fascination with anchoring into family has been a common thread in my life. And so I think going back and finding those breadcrumbs is really powerful.
So side note, but I was thinking,
yes,
of course you were fascinated with motherhood. Like, of course.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because often our interests are shaped by our lived experience as well. Like, it's this dynamic thing.
Yeah.
But for a lot of women who, you know, didn't happen to have a particular fascination with motherhood, pre-motherhood, they get into motherhood, and it requires you to develop a fascination with it because you're living it. And so part of how I've moved through the kind of development of my own work and way of being in the world has been shaped by all of those different factors along the way. And so, that shaped kind of where I am now in offering this information to others, but recognizing too the quite unusual experience of diving into maternal theory and maternal work before becoming a mother, and the way that was viewed and perceived, I think actually speaks to the broader construction of motherhood, because it was perceived with almost a sense of suspicion, with a strange, from other maternal scholars. You know, I'd go to conferences and be presenting on, you know, motherhood, good mother theory, all of this. And we'd be at the conference dinners and they'd say, so you're not a mum? I'm like, no. And they're like, why are you interested? And that's really telling. When I was trying to find a supervisor for my PhD in sociology, I had comments saying, like, what is it about this motherhood thing? Like, is it because you just really want to be a mother and that's why you're interested? Again, really telling. What it's saying there is that motherhood in and of itself is not seen as a worthy area of interest. It's not seen as something that is valuable and worthy in and of itself. It's seen as a means to an end, as a performance, as something that you do, as a biological expectation, as all of these other things. You know, we don't go to scholars who are doing, if I give a presentation in a university setting, I can almost guarantee is perhaps too strong, but I can anticipate that one of the questions will be, what about fathers? And so if I'm talking, my research is on mothering children with disabilities, I'll get a question about the fathers or the siblings. And yes, that, you know, it's people's interests, but also that's also really curious because we don't really do that with other disciplines. If someone's up there giving a presentation on the experience of Nigerian refugees, you don't often have people ask the question of, have you thought about, you know, refugees from Iraq? Like, in other words, when we create space to talk about motherhood and we inject value into that and we see that as worthy, creating that space raises discomfort in others, and holding and claiming a space of our own is threatened, you know, and that speaks to broader patriarchal construction of how these things work.
It's such a minimization, isn't it? Like, even the concept of is it just because you really want to have a baby? I'm like, why? Because now all of a sudden you don't have a brain or a purpose or, you know, and even that, yeah, but what about all these other people? Like, why are we spending time talking about the mothers when there's all these other people affected in, you know, similar ways? Like, it's such a minimization, isn't it?
It's a dismissal, and I actually find it really fascinating because most
I love that you find it fascinating. I find it aggravating.
I'm like, well, this is research topics, right? But like people have been mothered in some way, even if they didn't have a biological mother, they've been mothered or they've experienced mothering. They are mothers. A lot of women, most women are mothers. They are mothers, or they perform mothering work, caregiving work for others in their community. This is something which I think is relevant to almost everybody to be thinking and discussing, that you'll know a mother even in your workplace. I mean, it has very broad application and relevance, yet it's seen as like, oh, just a curious little side interest there.
What do you think is the value in having conversations like you do now? I know that you also run a membership group and workshops and programs specifically dedicated to this area of research and really expanding women's knowledge and insight into the cultural perceptions that they themselves are programmed with the view too, when you know it and see it, you have a voice then to shift it and change it. What is it? Hang on, I just lost my question then. How did I start that? I went off on a rant thinking about the change. How did I start that question, Bridgie? Do you know?
You didn't really,
it's gone for your head.
Like,
in my head, I had a question. You know, this happens in my head, and I disappear off into no man's land.
The purpose, maybe the purpose in why we, I don't know, what can come out of conversations.
Yes, that is what I wanted to ask. Yes. So when women sink into these conversations, what do you notice happens within them, and what would be the purpose of having these conversations? How does that create more freedom for women rather than just something that's interesting to, you know, dabble in?
Yeah, well, it can do a couple of things. I mean, one comment that I've had from women in, you know, my membership or talking about this is almost a frustration that they can't now unsee this. So once you adopt this lens and once you have this level of awareness and understanding, you start seeing it throughout your everyday experience, not only in your own behaviors and your own beliefs and your own perceptions, but you start witnessing it in others as well. And you also start noticing all of the ways that we're, for lack of a better term, shoulded on by others. And previously, if we didn't build in an awareness around that, it can feel quite comfortable. It's just the way things are done. This is just how it is. This is just part of being a mum. And you just, you know, you roll with it, right? With potentially a bubbling under the surface sense of discontent or dissatisfaction that you don't feel the safety to raise. But once someone actually names this and says, hey, this is bigger than you, this is actually a result of quite functional structures that are in place. And this is about something bigger than you, that can at first feel quite daunting and unsettling. And it can also be, you can be left with almost at first a sense of powerlessness, but I would argue it's a step towards your own reclaiming your own power. But like, oh my gosh, this is going on everywhere around me. I see it at school. I see it in the sleep industry. I see it in my community. I see it in my mother's group. I see it in my friendships. You start seeing it everywhere. And so it can be really overwhelming at first, which is why I think it's so important to be able to connect in with others who are in this space of kind of consciousness raising around this, because we can't do it alone. It's not something that we can confront alone. We need others.
Do you think that we're able to free ourselves from the good mother theory? I mean, can you just give us a little, maybe a little summary around what that even means and how we all carry aspects or versions of it, and how we start to use your work and the cultural narrative to step outside of that?
So at a really basic level, there's a difference between, this is what, feminist scholar and poet Adrienne Rich spoke about in her book Of Woman Born, which basically was like the birth of maternal theory. She makes a distinction between motherhood as the social structure, as the institution, she calls it, and mother in as the experience, the doing. And so you can be living within an oppressed motherhood, marginalised motherhood, while carving out space for your empowerment as an individual mother. So making that distinction can be comforting sometimes, to recognize that you can make shifts in your own life and you can live your motherhood in a different way without having to have the whole social structure changed or be the one to create that change, because we can't individually do it. But think of a fish tank. So if we were living within, I've used this analogy before, there's bunches you can use, but if you think of the fish tank as like the society, substitute motherhood out for, race or, class, anything that structures our experience of being, that's the tank. That's what we're living within. And we're the little fish swimming around within the tank. And if we don't have an awareness that the tank is there, we think that this is just the way that this is. We don't even see the tank. We're like, yep, this is life. This is how it's done. We don't question it. These are just the structures. Then when you start to build in some awareness of what you're structured by, of what the tank is made up of, you start looking at it curiously and going, interesting. The tank's here. I don't actually have as much freedom as I thought I did in the way that I swim. Then you start noticing what the other fish are doing. And you're like, curious. They seem to not realize they're in the tank either. And some do. And some are swimming a different way. And that makes me feel really uncomfortable. Why is that? Some are trying to swim at and bash into the tank. What are they doing? That's really disruptive. Can they please just stop doing that? It's really threatening my sense of safety.
Such a good analogy.
And
such a good analogy.
I'm loving it. It's so unacademic, but it makes sense. And
for the layperson over here, it's perfect.
I think it's great.
And so what we're doing in raising awareness of this work is we're first raising awareness of the tank that we're within. We're examining the tank and we're looking at all of the things that make it up. So what is a good mother? What does the tank say? Oh, it says that she should get married before she has kids. Oh, she's a white woman. She's white. She's middle class. She's heterosexual. She always puts her kids before herself. That's what a good mother does. She's self-sacrificing. She doesn't complain. She loves motherhood. She's fulfilled by motherhood. She's contented by motherhood. No, she doesn't get angry. She doesn't yell. She doesn't lose her temper. That's not what a good mother does. You can probably already notice as I'm saying this, the ways that you have recognized, potentially internalized or rejected some of these expectations. So if you ask yourself, what does it mean to be a good mother? And write out a list of all of those different traits. If we were to write them up on a whiteboard, there would be lots and lots of similarities because we're living within the same society that dictates what it is to mean. And the way this is so powerful is that you will feel the effects of this regardless of how much you fit within those constraints or not. So some people are automatically situated outside of it. Single mothers, you don't meet the markers of good motherhood. Got a disability, you don't meet the markers.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that actually. I'm happy for you to continue and then come back to it. But that was one of my questions was, as a single mother, how does this work sit for you and your experience of yourself within already a marginalised group? But please.
Yeah. So we have all of the different ways that we fit within or don't. But the reason why the good mother myth is so powerful is that you will feel like you need to box yourself into it in whatever way you can access it. So, I'm a single mother, don't meet the requirements there. I'm going to be really self-sacrificing. I'm going to give my everything to my daughter because I can't give her the perfect idealization of what it means to be a good mother. So I'm going to try and make it up for it in these other ways. And so that will play out in all different ways depending on where you're situated within this. But the catch is that no mother exists that fits within all of the constraints. There is not a person who exists that will meet all of the requirements of perfect motherhood, and it's designed to be that way. Because if we could fit within the constraints would end up dissolving because they wouldn't be purposeful.
So when you say that it's designed to be that way, who designs it? So where does that come from and why is it continued to be perpetuated? And what might it look like if we were to personify that as a room full of people? What are the levers that they're pulling? What are their motivations?
Like, in a really simplistic answer, like patriarchy, like that's how it works. So the ways that we're embedded within a construction of good motherhood, like exists for good womanhood as well. It exists for what a good man is as well. I mean, patriarchy isn't just about the disempowerment of mothers. It goes far beyond that. It's a structure and it's a system. But the reason why it's been able to be maintained is because there are kind of the elites who are in a certain position of power who make the rules. And it's not necessarily even done. I sometimes think that if we try and talk about, we have a yearning sometimes to talk about broader social structures in a personified way, because bringing it down can make it more accessible to see and to talk about. But I think sometimes when we do that, we can kind of simplify something that's too complex. And when we simplify, it's easy to just say, all the blame's there. Let's just put it all there. Let's just, if only, the school policy were changed, then it wouldn't be this way anymore. Like, we can have a yearning to do that. And in reality, the uncomfortable truth of it is that we also perpetuate this as mothers.
So we're complicit in it. So, and because I think back to my time working in media advertising and sales, and, grocery buyers as the category is like the biggest category. It's the biggest buying category. Like, the mother's eyeballs are the most profitable eyeballs that an advertiser wants to access. And so they're also crafting like the messaging and the products and the way that they use this particular model for that messaging to meet this good mother idealism. And then because they see that that's what sells, that continues to self-perpetuate, and then the mother over here continues to fit that because that's what she's culturally told who she needs to be. So it is this cycle, isn't it?
Yeah.
And because we buy into it, we are continuing to support it.
Yeah, exactly. And because that's the way that power operates. It wouldn't be effective if we could all actually recognize how it was working and start pushing back against it. It's only effective because we put it on ourselves. It's not, yes, we feel judgment from other people, and yes, we have expectations and we deal with little comments and all of that, and that's all symptomatic of the perfect mother myth, good mother ideology, however we want to term it. Coming back to the motherhood as the structure, we experience that in our mothering. But we discipline ourselves likely more than anyone else does. And that's why modern motherhood is almost synonymous with guilt, mum guilt, because mum guilt is a function of that. It's a way to try and keep ourselves in line, of noticing when we fall out of our line and, that's not good enough. That's not good enough. Feel guilty over that. And it's, as you said, Bridget, like it's a self-perpetuating cycle, because we feel it from others, we do it to ourselves, and we do it to other women as well.
I have a question on how these social and cultural contracts around motherhood change generationally, and how so many mothers listening, I know, will have issues with their own mother or their mother-in-law, and the comments that might come in, or the perceived judgments, or the relationship issues. And how much are those also consciously or unconsciously reflective of the constructs within which we're playing? Because generationally, what it meant to be a good mother 30 years ago has shifted and changed now. And many of our mothers and mother-in-laws can't understand what all the fuss is about, right, to be a mother today. And then they can take that to heart, or take that personally, which can then be a source of conflict. So can you talk about how that, overlays relationally?
Yeah, so I think the first point I wanted to make is just a real acknowledgement and recognition that it goes beyond social construction, even with our own motherhood. Like, this is my thing. This is the thing I talk about. Yeah. But this isn't the only factor, even with our own sense of guilt and all of that. It's not just social construction. It's also our childhoods and like all of that, and the amazing work that you two do, And so recognizing that it's the same with mother relationships with women who have mothered in generations before us, that how it plays out culturally is that to be a good mother, what it means now meant something totally different to what it meant 50 years ago. There's some fascinating research that I shared recently that showed that working mothers today are spending more time with their children than stay-at-home mothers did in the 1960s.
That's so amazing.
That's fascinating.
And so,
isn't that fascinating? Like, we have such this idealized version of what it was to be a stay-at-home mum, but it simply wasn't what it is now.
No. And the almost irony is that we are feeling the most amount right now. We're feeling the most amount of guilt in motherhood about not spending time with our children at the same point that we're spending the most amount of time with our children than we have before, kind of historically. So, I mean, we have to ask ourselves what the purpose of this is here. And all of the ways that it's because of the birth of intensive mothering ideology, the good mother myth. We have extremely high expectations placed on us and that we place on ourselves that did not face mothers before us. And this has to do with a whole bunch of things like globalization, technology, all of it, a bunch of stuff. But it's the recognition that, yes, we've had increasing technology with things around the house that may make it easier to manage the domestic load compared to, grandmothers, great-grandmothers. But in many ways, the pressures that we face is way beyond the ones that we faced back then. And not only that, our sense of community, and not just, yes, community in online spaces is incredible and something that we, mothers before us did not have. But our lived reality and the communities we're embedded within physically have disintegrated, dissolved, shifted. They don't exist in the ways that they used to. And so we were never meant to mother alone, yet that's how so many of us in the modern Western world are mothering. And so if we want to have a comparison between our motherhood and that of our mothers or our grandmothers or our great-grandmothers, we're viewing the lens through which we view our experience is shaped by a completely different social context. And therefore completely different social values as well. So it can be challenging, really challenging.
I love this conversation. But I did just want to touch on, before we wrap up, was the single motherhood experience. Now, obviously, that's not the lived experience of Bridget and I, and it is often something that we are written into about, and our listeners are asking questions around. Yeah, but I don't have a partner, so my experience of motherhood is harder, is more isolated, is, a multitude of different challenges. So I'm just wondering if you can speak around just however you want to take that.
Yeah. So firstly, recognition that if that's what your experience is, just really affirming that and validating that if that's how you view your experience and that's how you view it. And it's up to you to define what your current reality is. And that matches up with the research. In Australia, 1 in 3 single mothers are living beneath the poverty line. I mean, I just think that is a total injustice. And it speaks to the devaluation of mothering. And there's lots of different ways that I could access this conversation and look at social patterns and our legal system and all sorts of things. But I think something to share that may perhaps be some sense of maybe comfort, but a way to access a point of your own agency in this is that sometimes I think actually embracing the things which place us in a marginalised way, whether that be single motherhood or whatever else, sometimes that is actually where our power can be, because that is where, if we think of the structure of motherhood and the fish tank and all of that, that is where we can create a little crack. Like that is where we can say, well, I can never be part of that construction because I'm not white or I'm not heterosexual or I'm not in a partner relationship or whatever it may be. With my research, I don't have, my child does have additional needs. So we don't fit into the model of what it means to be a perfect family, a perfect mother-child dynamic. Well, there can be a freedom as well. Because you can go, well,
not fitting in.
That's right. Yeah. So it can actually be a place for you to access your agency and to pull on your individualism, ironically, in pulling on all of the social scripts that we have surrounding us that can feel like they sometimes trap us, to flip them. And that's been my experience. And it's been one that has been shaped by both of your work as well, in really seeing all of the incredible benefits that can come out of single motherhood, and the ways that really what you currently see as your point of pain or marginalisation can actually be also an incredible place for kind of a birth of growth and transformation and change.
It's beautiful.
I love that so much. So before we wrap up, Sophie, and you share where we can connect with you and find out all about your work, we would love to ask you our 3 interview quickfire questions.
Yes.
Question number 1 is, can you share with us an experience of where you felt a wound and you transformed that into wisdom?
Yeah, so probably relating a little bit to what I just spoke about in terms of single motherhood. And again, this was, impacted significantly through my work with both of you, that my husband, we were together for 7 years, wanted children, planned a baby. He was always keen for fatherhood. That was his lifelong dream, all of that. Had a, wonderful life together, and got pregnant really easily. And then when I was 41 weeks pregnant, I found a text message. He'd been having an affair. I kind of had a complete breakdown in every way. My labor started. I birthed my baby, and basically the birth of her was the destruction of all of the structures that I knew to be true, that I had my safety within. And so I kind of went through this period where basically her birth was the end of my marriage. And I didn't really come to see that in a blatant way until maybe 6 weeks later. But that was my experience of early motherhood. And for a long while, I felt really robbed. I felt like it was an incredible injustice. I had a lot of anger, and there was a whole bunch of stuff that's attached to that experience. But what I came to realize was that this is my journey, that this is my path, that it is purposeful in some ways, that it's more complex than we may like to make it out, and that we need to embrace the story and the narrative of our lives that most empowers us. And that is one that I chose to do, and shifting my belief and my understanding of what I've been through and who I've come to be as a mother, shifting my beliefs around that has shifted and changed my actual experience of it. So that would be the first answer to that question.
So big, love that. So powerful.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Yeah. The next one is books that have been most impactful for you, that you wish every woman would read in her lifetime, or that if you could, you would just gift every woman as she graduated high school. What would that be?
Well, yeah, this is such a big question, right?
For us book lovers, it is.
How do you choose? It's like choosing children.
How do you choose?
Yeah, well, okay, so I think I have to mention Adrienne Rich's Of Woman Born. It was published back in 1976, but it has as much relevance. Of Woman Born has as much relevance today as it did back then. But I actually would recommend a book that I recently read, which is Glennon Doyle's Untamed, because I think that it is just a really powerful way of speaking to our experience as women that would be accessible for people who are not mothers, but also provides us as mothers a recognition of that kind of caging that we live within, and how to rewild ourselves, how to untame ourselves, and to move beyond some of the structures we've been talking about.
Cool.
Good ones.
Last question. Do you want to ask it, Bridgie?
Yes. If you could have a billboard on any major highway in the world, what would it say?
My first response was something about motherhood, mothers matter, mothers are valuable, some sort of advocacy for mothers. But then recognizing that a billboard is something that we individually see and absorb. So probably what I would say is to have on there that you are and that you always have been enough. That we're already whole, we're already worthy, we're already it. It's just the uncovering of that.
That's so beautiful. Thank you,
really
Soph. Can you please share with us where we can connect with you and find your work in the world?
Sure. So you can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Dr Sophie Brock. My podcast is The Good Enough Mother, and my website is drsophiebrock.com.
Thank you. And you have a membership group. I'd love for you to share all programs that you have that women can access to dive deeper into this work.
Yeah, so I do one-on-one mentoring and also the membership, and it's basically just a space for us to all come together as women who are mothers, who are interested in diving deeper into this work, and it's called Liberated Motherhood. And I think that kind of speaks for itself, doesn't it? Kind of liberating ourselves from all of the shoulds and reclaiming empowered mothering of our own.
So beautiful. Thank you so much, Sophie, for giving us your very precious and valuable time and incredible wisdom that we just lap up and just want to breathe in. It's been absolutely delicious. So I really thank you for sharing this time with us.
Thank you for having me. It's been amazing.
So great.
And you can connect with us on nourishingthemother.com.au, Nourishing the Mother on Facebook, Instagram and Pinterest, and connect with you, Bridgie.
SuburbanSandcastles.com. And you, Jules?
Is thepleasurenutritionist.com.
Remember to nourish the woman to rock the family.
And we'll see you next week when we continue to peel back the layers on your mothering journey.
And if you want to support Nourishing the Mother and all the late nights, the early mornings, the blood, sweat and tears we pour into our art, then please go to patreon.com/NTM podcast and become our patron. As a patron, you're helping all of the cost of operating this podcast, the hosting, the editing, the transcription, helping all of that be completely covered, and joining a community who are all about honouring our journeys and continuing to open. The more support we have, the longer we can last. So become a patron. We'd love to have you. Go to patreon.com/NTM podcast. We literally couldn't do this without you. Thank you so much for listening, and please share this podcast with anyone you think it would be medicine for.
This has been a production of TheWellnessCouch.com. Check us out on Facebook and join in the conversation on Facebook.com/TheWellnessCouch. Subscribe to each show on iTunes and check us out on Twitter. The Wellness Couch, streaming wellness into your lives.
Whilst the Wellness Couch presenter endeavour to provide accurate and helpful information to their listeners, these podcasts cannot take into account individual circumstances and are not intended to be a substitute for health and medical advice from a qualified health professional. You should always seek the advice of a qualified health professional before acting on any of the information provided by any of the Wellness Couch podcasts.